For that very warm welcome. Greetings to all in the room there at Queen's. I'm sorry to not be joining you this morning. I'm just at the tail end of recovering from a bug, but I'm sure happy to have this opportunity to engage with you virtually, including many familiar names and also some new colleagues who are joining virtually from nearby and afar. This is a beautiful gathering of folks to contend with some big and important issues. So as I move into this set of reflections on global health, reimagining and what whiteness might have to do with it, I'd like to introduce you to Ed Connors and Lana James, who are going to be part of my talks, my comments this morning. You'll be hearing my voice, but their wisdoms are going to show up often. Ed is a PhD psychologist, and he's also a Mohawk elder from Ganawage, across the river from Montreal, who has worked from coast to coast to coast with Indigenous communities and also with lots of settlers like me. And Lana James is a Black anti-colonial grassroots leader and also the postdoctoral fellow in AI, medicine, and data justice here at Queen's, working with Professor Amber Simpson. I credit Ed and Lana, among others, for helping me find my lane in social justice work. And what might I mean by being in my lane? I mean not showing up with you today as an expert in anti-oppression or anti-racism or decolonization or allyship, not joining you here offering reflections as someone who's got it figured out and who's here to teach others. But instead, Ed and Lana have helped me to understand that my role is to make visible my experience. So to make visible my experience as a learner and an unlearner in the fraught and messy work of excavating my own deep ties to intersecting systems of oppression that produce inequity, systems that cause violence and harm to so many, systems that have given me unearned multi-generational forms of material advantage, systems of inequality that not only benefit me, but also limit the potential for my own freedom and humanity. So I will try to stay in my lane with you this morning. And to help me do that, I'm going to bring Ed and Lana with me as two of the main solidarity partners who both teach me and also hold me to account when I regularly lose my way in this work. And I often receive the teaching from Ed that it's not about getting the right answers so much as it's about getting the right questions. And so here's a question that never came up much in my own global health training, which is for each of you, who have you got who holds you to account? Who's the community that you've built around you intentionally of wise and caring ones who are far more advanced in the struggle for justice than you are, and with whom you are in deep, loving relation? And this is an especially important question for those of us who often find ourselves as among the most radical in the room in our healthcare or global health spaces. Everything's relative. Many of the spaces that each of us are in, we are the most radical one there. Yeah. And so it's incredibly important that we intentionally build circles of accountability outside of academic spaces to nourish us, to lift us up, to hold us to account, to help inform how it is that we responsibly leverage our power inside the academic spaces to disrupt when we're the most radical one there, to make way for different futures, and to reimagine, which brings us to today. Reimagining global health, which I hope to do in part by identifying questions I was never taught when it came to global health, questions never uttered or made real or relevant, but which have since become a North Star in my own work. And here's one of them. So I met with the great global health leaders, Heather Aldersey and Tammy Wu, to land on a title for this talk. And given that the focus of today's Kaleidoscope gathering is reimagining global health and especially partnerships, we landed together on the title that invites reflection on the question, what might whiteness have to do with this? What might whiteness have to do with this? And so again, a critical question for each of us to take up in this moment, in real time. When you think about reimagining global health, or your role in health in general, when is the first time that you considered the question, what might whiteness have to do with this? Take a moment, find yourself in time. When did that first come to you? For some of you, especially folks who are not white, you're like, oh, I've always been aware of that question. For others of us, it might be that this event is the first time that we are being invited to consider the role of whiteness in shaping global health. And for those of us who are white or have proximity to whiteness, right? It might be considering when's the first time that I considered what might my whiteness have to do with this. And I'll share that I was well into my global health career when a foggy, misty version of this question started to show up in my own mind. And actually, I don't think it was in my mind. I think it was in my belly. I think it was if I think back, this reckoning started with a sense of unease, an unsettled feeling that something was off in how I understood myself in my global health work. And this was a number of years ago, before I'd even heard of anti-oppression, before I had any sense of the embodied nature of justice work. And this reminds me of a different set of questions that I'd like to introduce to you now. This work around whiteness, excavating our ties to systems of inequality, I understand this to be anti-oppression work we are doing this morning. And anti-oppressive practice requires habits of mind that need to be nurtured. So if we've ever shared a space like this before, folks may recognize something I often do is introduce some meta work for participants to both be in the dialogue with me, but also watching yourself, being in this work of excavating our ties to these systems of oppression. And to do it, I want to introduce 3 questions for you to please write down, keep track of as we're doing this work. They are, what insights are landing for me? Since each of us have different messages to be taking today, this is not about the same set of facts that we all learn at the end of the talk. It's what are my lessons to learn today? Given the embodied nature of this work, it's how do I feel during this learning and unlearning? How can we center the practice of embodiment in this work? And most importantly, in the big font, what are my next steps for learning in action? These are the questions that I invite you to have in mind as you watch yourself being with me for these next moments. So back to our question of what might whiteness have to do with this? As part of staying in my lane, I'm going to reflect on this question from the perspective of being in a white body. I think most of my comments are transferable for folks who are not white, since we're all socialized to uphold whiteness as a structure, but I have a particular limited point of reference. And so for more nuanced perspectives, for members of our audience who are Indigenous, I'd be happy to point you to a wonderful teaching by Ed Connors, where he draws on the work of Elder B. Shawanda, and in which he spells out how colonization and whiteness have shaped Indigenous identities. And a wonderful resource designed by and for Black folks is the weekly Twitter space on Saturdays. It's sort of like a podcast, but a beautiful, engaged discussion in a radical Black tradition called AIMART, A-I-M-A-R-T, that's co-hosted by African-American physician Dr. Ejioma Nodine Opara and Lana James on excavating white supremacy in health and healthcare. So my reflections from this body on what whiteness might have to do with global health, connecting these dots. We know that the structure of whiteness is the underpinning of the tightly coupled coins or systems of inequality of racism and colonialism. This is central to the founding of Canada as a settler colony. This is how we come to be here. This is also colonization and racism at the heart of the fields that I love, that I've dedicated my life to. I'm talking about higher education, health professions, education, physiotherapy, healthcare, and especially global health. I was raised within these systems of oppression, and that means that I was raised to buy a big lie. And the lie is that these fields that were also shaped by these systems, including global health, are only good, that they're benevolent, and that as a result, I was trained to uncritically reproduce and extend them. However, many are bringing a critical lens to these fields, a critical turn, including global health, by which I mean a coherent power analysis that calls into question the assumed benevolence of these fields, right? That's what we're doing here, calling into question the assumed benevolence of global health. And a reminder that critical analysis doesn't mean that something's entirely bad. Rather, it rejects the assumption that something is entirely good. It starts from the standpoint that everything has both positive and negative effects. It's not neutral. And it tries to bring the negative into light so that we can mitigate those harms, and especially our own unwitting complicity in reproducing them. That's what we're doing here. Let's bring some things into the light. And specifically, what I'd like to bring into the light is the profound influence of whiteness as a power structure on global health. Why? Because my experience in global health and the academic health sphere in general is that whiteness as a power structure is largely unspoken and therefore unfettered. I am this fish. And whiteness as a power structure is the water I swim in, the water I have always swum in, the water I will be swimming in for the rest of my career as I try to move as an accountable academic, and yet about which I was meant to remain oblivious. Now, while I may be largely oblivious to the effects of whiteness, it's not that no one understands how whiteness works. Black, Indigenous, and other racialized struggle leaders have been trying to draw this to our attention in health and global health for decades. And recently, spurred by global uprisings in 2020, there's been an unprecedented willingness within global health literature to make room for naming the previously unnameable. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, I'm coming to you from the perspective of white body, and I offered some resources for folks who are Indigenous or Black to hear from folks in those bodies. I just want to honor, we have Anu Kumar, Ananya Banerjee, and Amy Tan here, all reflecting on their own complicity in and resistance against white supremacy in health and global health as racialized people who are neither Black nor Indigenous. So more excellent resources to turn to. And I'd like to share with you the wisdom and voice of Dr. Rochelle Burgess from her powerful piece released earlier this year about working in the wake. In the wake. In the wake of what? It was Lana James who introduced me to this concept of in the wake from which was created by Black studies scholar Christina Sharp. And then it was Dr. Burgess here who connected this idea to global health. So let me read to you from the opening of this paper. And I quote, "The problems with global health are many. They are as old as the discipline itself, inherited from colonial projects and paradigms that have existed as long as there has been exploration into other lands." In her recent work, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, Christina Sharp asks us to imagine and acknowledge that the world and life of Black people exist in and are shaped by the enduring afterlife of slavery, colonialism, and racism. Continuing, there is an awakening to the fact that every dimension of global health praxis has been inexorably shaped by its past. Undoubtedly, there's been an underappreciation of the consequences of the productive power of the ever-expanding body of knowledge, praxis, and practice that determines the why, how, and what of our discipline. Dr. Burgess goes on to say, this is the power of what historians dub the archive. And she concludes, and our archive has locked us into something we desperately need to change. Our archive has locked us into something we desperately need to change. Ed Connors would encourage us to reflect on what good questions get made possible by Dr. Burgess's remarks, our archive has locked us into something we desperately need to change. What have I unknowingly been locked into? What might change look like? And what might my whiteness have to do with this? And to affirm, when I say whiteness, I'm not vilifying people who are white, although we are deeply implicated in and by the structure of racism. Rather, when I say whiteness here, what I'm talking about is the power structure that is rooted in the concept of white supremacy. White supremacy, an idea that was invented hundreds of years ago by people whose skin looks like mine in order to justify, right? In order to justify European colonial conquest and the transatlantic slave trade. Why? In the pursuit of resource extraction, white supremacy, which has now become what Francis Ansley describes as a political, economic, and cultural system in which folks who are white overwhelmingly control power and material resources, where conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and where these relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are reenacted every day in all kinds of institutional and social settings, including ours. So this is at the heart of racism, of colonization. And while the language of taking anti-racist action has become more common within the academy and become more common within global health, we rarely make the leap to recognizing that that means uprooting white supremacy and how it intersects with other systems of oppression, how it's insidious, how it's tightly interwoven. And so we draw again on more great Black thinkers, Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins, who gifted us the notion of intersectionality, that we must pay attention not only to individual systems of inequality, but the complex arrangements of advantage and disadvantage that get produced by their intersections. Whew. So, a reminder, you got your 3 questions. What insights are landing? How does this feel? And especially, what are my next steps for learning in action? What are my next steps for learning in action? Because that's what this is about now. There's other work that I've done that takes more of an introductory welcome into the concept of racism. And I invite folks to have a look at any of that work. If you, there's lots that's posted on my faculty page. There's a 23-minute video in particular that's an introduction to whiteness and what to do about it. Today, I'm making the assumption that a lot of what I've just shared with you is actually already quite well known to you. And rather, it's about the jumping off point of, but where from here? How is it that we take action to move differently? So what? And so I'd like to use the rest of the arc here to get into the specifics of, how might we actually move differently? Or to try and draw on Ed's wisdom to frame it into the question that needs asking. Given the nature of white supremacy as an historic structure of domination and subordination, how might we understand how our own actions are related to either upholding or resisting white supremacy? How are our actions related to either upholding or dismantling white supremacy? And so what I'd like to do is offer you a framework that Lana, Ed, and I developed to try and make sense of this in our own work. And it's adapted from the work teaching tool developed by African-American scholar, Professor Barner Hesse at Northwestern, called the 8 White Identities. And when we ask the question, how are our actions related to upholding or dismantling white supremacy, you might rightly be thinking, whose actions? So again, just to name that, it's actually all of us, right? Like it's all of us. This is a structure, a system that we can either uphold or dismantle. So it's anyone. We've all been socialized to uphold this, to see it as normal, and we all need to be resisting it. But to be clear, this is especially the work that needs to be done by folks who are white or have proximity to whiteness. So here's the framework. It has two extremes, two poles. At one end, we call it a set of actions related to an identity we're calling white dominance. This is all the actions that one might do that explicitly advocate for and name and value white superiority. So this is what none of us are here to do, right? This is what folks who identify as white supremacists see as their work to do, to quite actively, intentionally uphold white supremacy. This is absolutely the rejection of where we want to be. But here's the fascinating thing. What is at the other pole? What is the opposite of actions that uphold and try to advocate for white superiority, right? White supremacy. What is the opposite of that? And I want to just share a short story that when we were trying to figure this out, right? To untangle this puzzle, try to give language to the ideas that Ed, Lana, and I had been working with. I remember it was during the pandemic and I was sitting on, it was a weekend, I was sitting on the couch in my parents' place in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto, for those joining us from afar. And we were, we had some work to be presenting this on the Monday. So there we were on the weekend, Lana and I trying to make sense of this and how do we give this language? And it was Lana that was able to teach me, that was able to help me see that the opposite of a society that's shrouded in white supremacy is one that we haven't seen before. It's whiteness transformed. It's a yet to be imagined future. She invited me to dream that there could be a different relationship that I have to whiteness as a white person, right? A yet to be imagined future that we collectively need to dream, that reflects that we've done the work of deconstructing and undoing the power that's invested in racial hierarchies. So it's this more beautiful future that we want to imagine moving towards. So those are the poles. So what's in the middle? And we've identified 3 sets of actions that we might populate in between these poles. And it's not just that you land in one place, it's that I at least land in all the places all the time in the course of a day or a week, sometimes in the course of the same meeting. I will undertake actions that move through each of these different levels. So let me elucidate what each of these might be as a framework for thinking, a mental map for thinking about the actions we undertake that either uphold or dismantle white supremacy, that move us towards whiteness transformed. And let's begin with white neutrals. These are all of the actions that do not see or name whiteness as a site of power, right? This is all the work that we do in EDI and anti-racism that never names or understands whiteness. So this was at least the first half of my life. So being very concerned about racism, but understanding it not as structural, not as being rooted in history, but as only interpersonal, something that only bad people do. And you know what that makes possible, that misunderstanding? It means that any feedback that I might get related to my complicity in racism, I receive as an attack on my character, an attack on my goodness. If I think racism is something that only bad people do, then when I receive feedback, and I do often, that what I just did, because I'm in the weeds of this work, right? We're gonna make mistakes, especially as white folks. So when I receive feedback that what I've done has reproduced racism, when we're operating in a white neutral frame, If we think that racism is something that only bad people do, it means that I receive that feedback as the message that I'm a bad person. And I respond in kind, right? I respond with a focus on my intention, on being attacked, and it completely shuts down the possibility for my own learning. It makes impossible trust building with the person who's offered that feedback. These are also the actions that understand viewing colorblindness as a form of anti-racism, as opposed to a strategy that upholds it. And this is especially all of the EDI or JEDI or EDIIA activities that tacitly diagnose the problem as a lack of diversity, right? As sometimes folks will know, I talk about the coins, the systems of inequality, and the folks on the bottom of the coin being folks who have historically been pushed to the margins. This is framing the problem as the bottom of the coin. And therefore, the work to do is to populate spaces with more folks from the bottom of the coin, which of course we should. It's unjust that folks have historically been excluded, and it limits our possibilities for excellence, limits our own humanity for those on the top. But that's not the source of the problem. The problem is the way the systems are baked into everything we do. So by focusing on diversity of the issue, it enhances the normalization of whiteness as a power structure. These are all the actions of white neutrals. What about white polites? What about white polites? Here's where my actions are a little more radical. Here's where I'm taking more risks. The challenge is that I'm doing it with the wrong frame. I'm doing it in the spirit of doing things as a white person for racialized folks. And therefore, my action is motivated by being seen as good. My goodness is once again bound up in this. And it makes work for my racialized colleagues to have to validate my feelings in this work. These are all the times where I care deeply about justice until it actually calls my own niceness into question, my own comfort, where there actually might be some conflict. And suddenly my desire for justice gets trumped by my desire to not make things uncomfortable. And this is the space in which I will take, big risks and do things out of the ordinary and try to move within my sphere of influence. And I'll mess up from time to time. And when I get feedback on my complicity, what you just did messed up. These are times, again, that I view it as a personal attack, as a lack of gratitude. Don't you see what I'm trying to do here? I should never have tried in the first place, right? This is me wanting to flee. These are the actions of white polites. And so what are white change makers? What are these actions? This is the alternative to the misorientation of the first two, where we are situating ourselves within the context of collective liberation. That these coins are bad for all of us. Our liberation is bound up in dismantling these coins. It's all the actions where we take on board critiques of whiteness as a power structure, where we act to interrupt our complicity. This is where we are concerned with not only dismantling whiteness, but its intersections insidiously with all the other power structures. This is where we know that making mistakes is part of the work. It's a sign that we're in the work. And we nurture a practice of apology, ownership, making amends, and showing with our actions that we are changing. And for white folks in particular, this is what Barner Hesse describes as whiteness speaking back to whiteness, being willing to put something on the line. So here they are, from the position a little differently on the image here, but the white dominance at one end, whiteness transformed at the bottom, and you can see we move through 2, 3, 4 to white change makers. And what we can see so clearly is that the yellow here around white dominance, this is the danger zone. This is what upholds white supremacy. But here's the thing. So do the actions of white neutrals and white polites. It is the actions situated closer to white change makers that are the ones in which we are interrupting white supremacy. Yeah? And so let me offer one more metaphor to help land these ideas. And it's a football metaphor that I learned about from great Indigenous physician and public health leader, Marsha Anderson. And in it, I talk about, again, the coin, as well as the top of the coin, unearned advantage, bottom of the coin, unearned disadvantage. So here's the metaphor. We have the circles trying to get to the end of the field, a football field. We have some folks joining us from afar. I'm talking about Canadian football here, American football, not soccer. And so they're trying to get the ball down to the other end of the field. And in this metaphor, you see the little pink circle. That is the person on the bottom of the coin, the struggle leader fighting the oppressive system. This is where the great social struggles have always been led. So this is the person on the bottom of the coin trying to get the ball of racial justice to the end zone. And in this metaphor, I'm going to use the color purple to reflect folks on the top of that coin. So white folks, folks with proximity to whiteness, or folks who are otherwise upholding white supremacy through their actions. So where we often find ourselves until we are resisting white supremacy is here on the X team as one of the folks who usually, especially in global health work, is unwittingly part of the group that is reproducing white supremacy, that is blocking the group that is trying to move this ball down the field towards justice. Whereas where we want to be is over here as one of the O's. And note that we didn't run over and take the ball from the quarterback, right? From the pink O. We got in line and joined the team to work in collective action to help block and make way collectively for this work of getting down the field. But this just isn't interpersonal, individualistic, is it? It's always as a collective. And the problem is that there are so many of us who are showing up on the X team unwittingly creating these obstacles to progress around justice because of our inability to understand our complicity in upholding white supremacy. Whereas what we want to be moving towards is all kinds of us joining in collective action, working in solidarity across the coin towards our own collective liberation. And so these X's, what are these actions? It's not just the actions of that first category, white dominance. It's all the times our actions reflect white neutrals and white polites. We are still on the X team. It's when we move to being white change makers that we are actively part of the struggle going in the right direction. And so in my final moment here, I bring you back to your questions. Which one are you drawn to now? Take a moment. Jot yourself one bullet. And I'd like to introduce a fourth question and ask you to write yourself one bullet for that one as well. And it goes like this. What is an insight or intention that I want to take with me into today, into today's discussion of reimagining global health? Thank you very much.